the passage, of course, that's quoted by usually people who are denying women the right to speak or lead in Christianity. They say women should keep silent in churches. They're not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, even as the law says. So the law is key here. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Okay, so this passage fits within a larger context of what Paul writes about women. And so there are other tricky passages too. This is not the only difficult passage in the entire Pauline corpus, but it is undoubtedly the most difficult passage because for a number of reasons. So the reason why this is such a difficult passage is there is a lot of evidence that the historical Paul did not think like this. And yet this passage is in all the earliest manuscripts. So there's no evidence of any manuscripts lacking this passage. There is an argument for an interpolation that this is not original to the epistle, but as I will demonstrate, I think that argument is incorrect. But I also believe, with a lot of critical scholars, that the historical Paul was a gender egalitarian. He was not the misogynist, not the person who denied women's speaking authority that he is commonly represented as in traditionalist circles. So the traditionalist view of Paul as denying women's leadership goes back to before the Council of Nicaea, as we see the emerging hierarchy as the church starts to form into its bureaucratic institution. The denial of women's leadership becomes important, and so Paul is used to justify that institutional development. And so that's when the interpretation of these passages, the normal interpretation of these passages emerges from that time, like the 3rd century. Early 3rd century is when you see this sort of conventional wisdom about this passage. But why is it that people say that there's something wrong here? Because the same epistle, the first epistle to the Corinthians, which is one of the earliest and most popular Christian documents by far, says elsewhere that women are allowed to speak in church, right? And I don't want to quote verses and chapters because off the top of my head, because I might make a mistake, but suffice it to say, earlier in the epistle, when they're talking about women prophesying with their head covered, that's in the context of the liturgical assembly. So you can't have women prophesying with covered heads in the church and not speaking, right? So the fact is that over and over again throughout the genuine epistles of Paul, women's ability to speak in church is somewhat taken for granted, and except for in this passage. All right, so let's go one more slide onward. So I am a proponent of what's commonly referred to as the quotation refutation hypothesis for explaining this passage. So Paul is not somebody who is writing in a vacuum here. He's not just composing this letter from scratch. The first letter to the Corinthians is actually a response to a letter from the Corinthians to Paul. It's a lost letter. We don't know exactly what the letter contained, but and Paul's letter to the Corinthians is addressing controversies and difficulties raised by the letter from the Corinthians to Paul. The congregation in Corinth is a Gentile-dominated congregation with a few Jewish Christian elites. So it's, there are, not to say there aren't Jews there, but the Jewish leaders of the Jesus movement are not the majority of that group. And so they've written a bunch of, things about the problems that they're facing in the congregation. Paul is correcting them and giving them advice. So the quotation refutation hypothesis suggests that this passage 34 through 35. 33 is actually technically part of the earlier, the 33b is sometimes used to introduce the passage in modern interpretation, but it's actually more a conclusion to the previous passage. So the 34 and 35 are actually a quotation of the lost Corinthian letter to Paul, and Paul's response is indignant and is a twofold negative rhetorical query where he's actually admonishing the male speaker of the previous passage that the male speaker of the previous passage, or the writer of the previous passage, is incorrect. What? Did the word of God originate with you? Or are you the only ones it has reached? And the key to this interpretation, and by the way, this quotation refutation hypothesis has been proposed independently by English-speaking and critical scholars, by at least 4 of them in the last 150 years or so. So over the last 150 years, about 4 different scholars, independently using just the grammar and the structure of this passage, proposed a quotation refutation hypothesis here. And the basis for that is both the translating the eta, which is the beginning of verse 36, as a what, as an epithet expressing disagreement, like a negative particle, and then the fact that the word only ones, which is munos in Greek, that this word is the masculine version of that pronoun, indicating that the person being criticized there is male, or a group that includes males. That can be a gender neutral construction, which is how it's conventionally read, is like a gender neutral reference to the congregation. But if the passage was referring to women exclusively, they could have chosen a feminine pronoun in that position, and the author didn't. Paul did not, which indicates that there is tension between these 2 passages. Okay, you can go to the next slide. People who regard this as an interpolation, which is the other view of egalitarian Paulists. So reminder, traditionalist Paulists think that Paul really thought this. The critical scholars who regard Paul as a gender egalitarian, somebody who believed that women should be leaders on the basis of a lot of other evidence to that effect. These folks either regard it as a quotation like I do, or as an interpolation, the way that, some scholars who, Bart Ehrman, I think, is on the interpolation side, as a number of other important scholars are. And the basis for that is that it's unstable. That passage is not always in the same place in the manuscript. There are some manuscripts where it is moved to the end of the chapter, following verse 40. And then there's another basis for the interpolation argument, is the lack of Paul's use of the word permit, permitted, permit. That Greek word never appears in any of the other epistles attributed to Paul, except for one, which is the first letter to Timothy, which is almost universally regarded as a forgery by critical scholars. So critical scholars regard 1 Timothy as fake Paul or pseudo Paul. He's called the pastor. And there's, you can go into lots of reasons. I will in the next slide talk about why we think that 1 Timothy is definitely a forgery. So this passage, 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 16, is a very close parallel in both its intent, the silencing and subordination of women, as well as its grammatical structure, the fact that it uses this verb permit it's the other case of it. So the fact that there's such a close linguistic parallelism between these 2 passages has caused the interpolation proponents to say that whoever interpolated it was imitating 1 Timothy. So they were basically taking a snippet, paraphrasing, spin on 1 Timothy, and then they inserted that snippet into 1 Corinthians to have this genuine epistle of Paul say something that the forgery in his name later argued. And I'll explain why I don't think that's what happened. You can, so this passage, 1 Timothy 2:11 through 16 has a lot of other things in it that are unpauline.